have anything recorded yet. So you all might get a notice that we're recording this just so that you're aware. And that's a helpful reminder too, that we'd love for you to be honest and open, and just know that this is recorded and people can register and watch the archive, or you can come back in and watch the archive. And so we'll offer that as part of our introduction. But I'm Monica Rice. I am the alumni director at McPherson College and also the director of constituent relations. And it's really my joy to connect with the church. That's a lot of my role in constituent relations. And I get to help coordinate this Ventures in Christian Discipleship program. And we're so glad to have many friends of the program here on Zoom this evening, and also to see some new faces to Ventures. And we're so excited to include your voices in the conversation. I know that some of you are inspired to take the class because you're connected with Scott Holland, our presenter this evening. Others may be curious about the topic or have heard about this program through your own connections. And so we're just really happy to have you here for whatever reason you're joining us. And I'll just take a moment to introduce Scott. Scott Holland is the Schleybaugh Professor of Theology and Culture and Director of Peace Studies and Cross-Cultural Studies at Bethany Theological Seminary. For those on the call that are part of the Church of the Brethren, I hope that you know that Bethany is the seminary of the Church of the Brethren, and it's located in Richmond, Indiana. For others that are joining us that are friends of the Church of the Brethren, Bethany is the place to be studying, especially if you want to know more and study more with Scott Holland. And so Scott is joining us tonight from his home in Yellow Springs, but I think he just zoomed across the state in his Subaru from his home in Pittsburgh. He shares time between those two homes. He's spending this fall semester on sabbatical, so we're so grateful that he's sharing as part of the Ventures program while he's on his break and doing some of his own research. And this evening, he'll be talking about Christ, culture, and God talk for the coming church. But just especially for those that have spent time on other Ventures courses, you may know that a lot of our format is very lecture-based, and you get to take a lot of tidbits home and think about them. Well, we invited Scott to have a course that's a lot more conversational. And so that's one of the reasons we're using Zoom, so we can see and hear one another. And Scott's going to do a great job at framing up the conversation and then helping us all talk together this evening. So I'm not going to take any more time. I'm so glad to see those that have joined us and continue to join us. We've got Sherry and Treva and Elsie and Lowell and Sarah that have come on since we did our greetings. And with that, I'll turn the conversation over to Scott. Thank you so much for being here this evening.
Thanks, Monica. And it's very good to be with all of you in this Ventures class and to enter into some conversation with you. As Monica said, I'll frame some of the conversation with some lecture-like presentation, but it will be very brief, and I'm really counting on you to freely enter in. Really, I'll conduct this class like some of our Bethany seminar classes, which are very conversational. We begin our Bethany classes always with a prayer, a poem, a story, or a song. And so following that pattern this evening, I would like to begin with a poem and with a short prose reading. The poem is by Walt Whitman. Some of you know that I collect books and ephemera. Ephemera happens to be letters and papers and magazines. And my most recent acquisition is this McClure's magazine from October 1897. And Whitman's poem, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer, is placed in this issue. So I would like to begin with this poem. When I Heard the Learned Astronomer by Walt Whitman. When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and the diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I was sitting, I heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room. How soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. I selected this poem because hopefully our conversation tonight will be more than theory. Hopefully this will intersect with our modes of being in the world, with our lived lives. Whitman was a very embodied poet. He loved to attend lectures and learn, but as he communicates in this poem, he was driven outside after hearing the astronomer into the moist, mystical night air to gaze up and to experience the stars. The second reading to center us a bit for the evening comes from a book that I would highly recommend to you. It's a recent book entitled See No Stranger, a memoir and manifesto of revolutionary love by Valerie Carr. Valerie Carr is a member of the Sikh faith. Some say Sikh, but the proper pronunciation is Sikh. And I'm reading this passage because we have just commemorated 9/11. And after 9/11, many members of the Sikh community in the United States were targeted. They were mistaken for Muslims. The Sikh movement is not Islamic, it's not Hindu, it's a separate movement. And in this book, Valerie Carr calls for the embrace of religious pluralism, and she reflects upon the interconnectivity of all of us in the human family. And like Whitman, she is drawn to wonder. So let me read this brief passage from See No Stranger. But you don't have to be religious in order to open yourself to wonder. You only have to reclaim a sliver of what you knew as a child. If you remember how to wonder, then you already have what you need to learn how to love. Wonder is where love begins. But the failure to wonder is the beginning of violence. Once people stop wondering about others, once they no longer see others as a part of them, they disable their instinct for empathy. And once they lose empathy, they can do anything to them or allow anything to be done to them. Entire institutions built to preserve the interests of one group of people over another depend on this failure of imagination. Valerie Carr. Check out the book. I would highly recommend it. I used it last academic year in a Peace Studies public theology class. Well, you've all read the description of what we hope to talk about together this evening. I think two guiding questions that will provide an opportunity for some conversation to get us thinking will be, what is religion? And then, what is the purpose of religion? I think in this season of fierce church and culture wars and intense polarizations that are not only political, but often religious or theological as well, It's wise and well to pause and ask the question, what is religion? But I think more importantly, to ponder what is the purpose of religion. The description also noted the decline of traditional or conventional religion, especially in North America and in Europe. Yet there remains an intense interest in spirituality. Back in March of 2019, a number of us traveled to Bridgewater College, Bridgewater, Virginia, a Church of the Brethren liberal arts college. They hosted a large and an important conference entitled The Status of Brethren Organizations, Demise and Momentum. And representatives of various agencies, organizations, and churches of the denomination gathered together to ponder the reality of demise and decline of the church, of traditional religion in North America, and then to wonder together about the possibilities for new momentum. I'm going to read just about 3 or 4 paragraphs from my presentation there at Bridgewater, which intersects with our theme for tonight. Robert Jones has announced the end of white Christian America. This engaging analysis confirms what Van Jones has concluded about the disturbing white lash against the browning of America in the age of Trump. Those cultural and political dynamics call pastors and seminary professors to both decolonize God and to carefully consider the ethical implications of the shifting data sets we see in church and in society. Indeed, in recent years, my seminary students have been very attentive to the changing demographics and to what is often called the data of decline, as they reimagine theology, ethics, and the future of ministry. For example, we recently read the conclusions of the 2018 American Family Survey. This survey reports that fewer than half of Americans consider religion to be an extremely or even a very important part of their identity. The nones, those who identify with no religion, now make up 35% of the American population. Among millennials, that figure is about 45%, and that number continues to increase each year. The Pew's Center of Religious Typology study finds that the religiously unaffiliated numbers are even higher than the numbers of this study from the American Family Survey that I just cited. Many of my students are drawn to the spiritual, not religious demographic research of Linda Mercadante. Her research reports that young adults are 3 times more likely to be religiously unaffiliated than older Americans, thus indicating that these numbers that so concern religion watchers will continue to spike in this decade. However, rather than predicting the end of faith or the end of spirituality, Mercadante and her study suggests that these statistics might in fact be revealing a new faith demographic, those who are spiritual but not religious. In fact, many sociologists of religion are suggesting that those who claim to be spiritual but not religious is the fastest growing religious demographic in North America. This then, I think, perhaps invites us to reflect upon, well, what is religion? What is spirituality? And really, what is the purpose of religion? Not long ago, when the COVID numbers had flattened out and were even going down and it was safe to be with some family members, I was with some of my extended family, and some of my cousins' children in their 20s were talking about a rather unpleasant woman who lived across the street and was really a kind of menace to the neighborhood children, a menace to the neighbors, and just generally quite nasty. And then one of my cousin's kids, a very smart young woman, commented, well, she is, of course, a Christian, you know, of course. And then she looked at me and said, oh, sorry, Scott, knowing that I am a theology professor and one who still has preacher's papers. But I thought that response was telling. She is, after all, a Christian, right? Huh. What else would you expect? When I first started teaching at Bethany in partnership with the Earlham School of Religion, a number of young Quaker students would profess, I'm Quaker, but not Christian. About 5 years later, some of my good Mennonite friends and relatives who were 20-somethings began to profess, I'm Mennonite, but not Christian. And now I'm hearing some of my best and brightest students, yes, at the seminary, sigh, some days. I'm really still brethren, but I wonder if I'm still Christian. I think you get the idea of what we're working with here today. I cited Robert Jones and his book, The End of White Christian America. Robbie was actually the keynote speaker at that Bridgewater conference that I cited. And in his study, he's suggesting that we're seeing what Van Jones would call a white lash, otherwise known as a backlash, against what we're seeing as the diversification, the pluralism, indeed the browning of America, and that a number of white Christian men are intent upon clinging to power and to position, but demographics are shifting greatly. Well, with that in mind, and of course I could say much more about these statistics and these shifting demographics, I thought it would be interesting to hear from some of you on these two questions. They overlap, I think, in terms of possible responses, but I would like for us first to ponder, what is religion? Now, some of you might feel a bit intimidated to jump into the conversation and offer your definition of religion. And if so, let me put you at ease. Because scholars of religion have recently concluded this, and I quote, there is no scholarly consensus over what precisely constitutes a religion. Let me say that again. there is no scholarly consensus now over what precisely constitutes a religion. If you go to Wikipedia, for example, you will find close to 50 pages attempting to define what is religion. And many of the definitions contradict one another. Some complement one another. But the writers of this entry in Wikipedia also conclude and warn there is no scholarly consensus over what precisely constitutes a religion. So, if any of you feel uneasy about moving into the conversation, know that there is no scholarly consensus on this. And your responses will be very helpful to me because I believe very much that doing theology and teaching theology as I do at Bethany and the Earlham School of Religion is a conversational endeavor. It is a comparative endeavor. It is something that emerges from democratic conversations and engagements with others. And so there is no official doctrine or dogma defining the essence of religion. There are many conversations about it, and I'm trying to actually focus in on some of these conversations and get more clarity for myself as I'm in conversation with our students. So I'd like to begin with that question, what is religion? And then later, after some conversation, we will move to what is the purpose of religion? Maybe what is good religion, what is bad religion, what is beyond religion, whatever direction you would like to take this. And that will then open up many other possibilities for conversation. This is your class, not my class, which means I want it to move in a direction that is most helpful to you and for you in your mode of being in the world and in the life of your mind, the passions of your heart, and all that you ponder in your lived life. So let's begin with the question, what is religion? And I'll be actually writing down some of your responses to keep them in mind and to reflect upon them in weeks ahead. What you can do is unmute yourself on a large screen like this, unlike a screen of some of our classes where we only have about 8 or 10 students and you're all easy to see. I can call on you, but don't feel a need to be called upon. Enton is watching the screen if I miss anything, but feel free to actually unmute yourself and enter in without being officially called on if you are so inclined to do so. It's open for conversation, and it looks like Diane already has something in the chat. So Diane, you are welcome to add your voice to the conversation.
Don't really know that I need a voice if I've got the chat room.
Yeah, you do, because this is conversational. Let me tell you what annoys me very much in teaching a class these days. We're finding that students are doing so much on chat that they then begin a side conversation among themselves and others don't feel included. So yeah, we want this to be a conversation that all can hear and so that we're all really moving together in this. So well, yeah, thanks, Diane. Good to see you again.
With it, yeah, thanks. With this old proverb, half of it says religion is man's search for God, and that makes me wonder then when you talk about people claiming to be spiritual but not religious, or being Mennonite but not Christian, what does spirituality mean then, if that's not also a search for God?
Okay, that's a great question, and we might want to pick up that question and name it as, what is God? And then I'm going to push that even further, and I'm going to quote the great Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who raises this question. If you've ever heard Tutu, he's very playful. And with a big smile on his face and a bit of a giggle, he poses this question. Yeah, what was God before God became a Christian? What was God before God became a Christian? So let's hold those questions, Diane, because I think as we're talking about what is religion and what is the purpose of religion, certainly God shows up. And it will probably then be useful to ponder what is God or who is God? How do we name God in the process of naming ourselves? And we might even want to engage Archbishop Tutu's question, what was God before God became a Christian? Good, but let's work a little bit with this question, what is religion?
Scott?
Yes.
I think that I have heard somewhere that religion was a combination of religio. And that adds another dimension to what Diane said, which is that is the reconnecting of people into a community. And I think that carries something of what religion might be as well.
Great. Yes, religio is a reconnecting, sometimes defined quite literally as a kind of binding, not a painful binding, but a binding together. And it has been used metaphorically then to imagine a binding of ourselves to one another and a binding of ourselves to the divine. So that's useful. Yeah, a binding, a connecting, an embrace in some ways.
Legio, I think, is also the root of the word ligament.
Yeah, very good. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
When I think of religion, I think of structure. And that really talks about the binding also. When I think of my religion, Christianity, Church of the Brethren, I think about the foot washing and the communion we take, the bread we make together, the love feast, and it's the practices. And then getting further on in spirituality, it's what I do with those practices internally, what I do.
Good, Colleen. Yes.
Kind of tailing along with what Colleen was saying, I really do not like the word religion. I prefer to use faith. To me, religion, when I think of religion, I think of ceremonies and rituals and practices. And being raised Catholic, that was a deep part of our faith, our practices. And coming into the Church of the Brethren, I was happy that they didn't do a lot of that. And now I recognize that with our ordinance, such as foot washing and baptism and stuff like that, I think of those as more symbolic gestures as opposed to gestures that are necessary for our faith. So I like to say I have a faith. My faith is Christian, but I'm not religious because I do not like ceremony. I do not like ritual. And I know, like I said before, we do some of that with our liturgy, in public worship, in corporate worship. But as far as religion goes, it's like, to me, that's like fingernails on a chalkboard when I hear that word.
I think that
Yeah,
raises a good point that for many people, when they think of religion, what they think of is a systematic collection of rituals. And I think any ritual any practice is in danger of becoming a ritual, which to me is something that was originally meaningful and symbolic, but now you do it just because you do it. Our congregation is famous for, it's famous in our congregation, the battles of the past over how many holes do you put in the communion bread. And it almost, at one point, was in another generation, great anger. Well, that's become a ritual for itself, not for the meaning that it has.
If religion, if the root meaning of religion has to do with binding together, being drawn together, what does that say about how we find God? Can you find God outside of the group? And when people say I'm spiritual but I'm not religious, I guess in some ways I see I don't want to say a danger, but I guess I question what is this? I guess this lone quest for who God is or whatever. I guess I see religion, the part that I identify with is that aspect of a communal search that it's important for me to do my own thinking, but it's also important for me to get the input of the corporate group, because I think that adds to my understanding and to everyone's understanding.
Yeah, so for you, religion, if we're using the definition of that which binds and binds together, and remember that is one definition, Alfred North Whitehead, the great process theologian and mathematician and process philosopher, said that religion is what we do with our solitude. So for him, religion was a very solitary mode of being. I'm aware that a number of persons are wanting in, and I'm not always seeing the order in which you are seeking to get in. Perhaps Enton has a better eye on that. So I'm going to look to Enton to help identify who might be next.
So we'll go with Terry Lynn and then Eric and then Kendra.
Thanks, Enton. Terry Lynn.
Terry Lynn, we can't hear you, so, and you're not marked as muted, so I'm not sure if something is wrong with your mic. And so, Eric, let's go to you, and Terry Lynn will try to figure it out, and then we'll try again, okay?
I'm thinking of some of Josh Brockway's presentations that I've been part of. And one in particular sticks out to me from National Youth Conference 2018, where he was working with this whole spiritual but not religious. And kind of thinking back to that, it kind of strikes me that religion and spirituality are two sides of the same coin, and that religion is the system or the way in which we organize ourselves around common views and beliefs, and a structured way of expressing our spirituality. But I also wonder too if the nuns and the duns are growing, they're the spiritual but not religious are growing. I wonder too if it's possible to be religious but not spiritual, to give ourselves over to just the rituals and, oh yeah, I went to church, making a habit, but having those habits, those rituals, those practices having no real impact on our lives, our faith, our spiritual formation.
Eric, there actually are some persons, some ecumenical colleagues of mine. I can think of one Roman Catholic priest, and I can think of one Orthodox priest who have said to me boldly, I am religious, but not necessarily spiritual. And I asked them to unpack that. And in essence, they said to them, they think all of the pondering on the interior life is not really the essence of religion, that the essence of religion is the rituals, the practices, and how those rituals and practices might translate into morality and ethics in personal and in public life. I was taken aback when they said it so boldly. I am religious, but not necessarily spiritual. And they offered a rather strong critique of my notion of existential, interior, poetic spirituality.
Mary Lynn, let's see if your mic works now. Nope, we're not hearing you yet. Sorry. We may have to read your chat, but you can try once more. Let me go to Kendra, and Terry Lynn will come back to you again.
What I want to add is maybe a little bit different angle. Our Sunday school class in the last number of months read Brian McLaren's Faith After Doubt. And one of the things that he offered that struck me, I was at a place where I wondered, what is the purpose or the importance of religion, struggling with that question. And what he offered really made me think. And he said that if religion is about belonging and meaning making, whatever that meaning making is, and if people do not have a certain what we might consider religions, Christianity, Jewish, Buddhist, whatever it is, if there's not that space to be in community and life-giving meaning making, where might people go that may not be as life-giving for all? So I just want to add that piece and maybe broaden what meaning making might mean.
That's great. Certainly, I think an important dimension of the definition of religion is the search for meaning. And one of the classic books by Viktor Frankl on the search for meaning, he wrote it before inclusive language, and it's called Man's Search for Meaning. If he were with us today, he would make that title inclusive. But he felt very strongly that a central component of religion was the quest for meaning. How do we find meaning in life, and where do we find it? And Frankl, as some of you know, went through the Holocaust. And so thinking about the problem of God and even the problem of humanity was huge for him, yet nevertheless, this quest for meaning.
Reynaldo, would you like to speak next? Reynaldo, you're still muted as well. If you're there, you go.
Okay, there we go. I go along with the what people have said, as religion is that which binds us into community. But my observation as well is that altogether too often, religion is something that is corrupted, and which becomes a barrier between differently identifying religious communities rather than a bridge. True religion, in my estimation, is a bridge builder, not a barrier builder. And so we have to be careful about how we express our religion, how we use our religion. Do we use it to build bridges, or do we use it to build barriers?
Oh, very thoughtful response. Is religion about maintaining barriers and boundaries, or is it about building bridges? Important thing to ponder, I think, as we continue to define what is religion. Others?
Hey, Steve, coming to you. Unmute and go ahead and share.
I want to talk a bit about transcending Christianity. I am Christocentric, but I don't believe that Christ is the way. I believe Christ is a route to God. When I was a child, my parents visited Andrew Cordier in New York, came back and reported that they went to the All Faith Chapel that Dag Hammarskjöld had built, and that there was a statue with the symbols of all the world's religion. That was reinforced when I went to Manchester College and read Houston Smith's book on world religions. And then following graduation from there, as a conscience objector, I went to Laos, which is 80 to 90% Buddhist. And all my neighbors and coworkers were Buddhist. And that's been reinforced the last couple of days. I've been reading Howard Thurman, and he talks about experiencing the divine when he's in non-Christian space. One of the reactions I get from my children who don't go to church is that all the conflict and all the conflict that is based on religion is one of the reasons that they no longer are involved in the life of the church. And so my route to God is through Christ, but I think it's important that we develop mutual respect for Islam, for Judaism, for Hinduism, for Native American religions, for many other routes to God.
Thanks, Steve. And I think this notation of Christocentrism is very much part of conversations today. You know, I think, and I'll refer to some of my students today, are really pondering the dance between what we might call theocentrism and Christocentrism. That is to say, are we primarily oriented to God, or is Jesus such a central focus that questions about God and the mystery of God actually are not pursued because we think we know so much about Jesus? You mentioned Howard Thurman. Howard Thurman has been very important in a program that we have at Bethany Earlham called Theopoetics, his emphasis on mysticism. Interesting that you mentioned him, because just before I logged on, I was reading a new collection of Howard Thurman's sermons entitled The Way of the Mystics. And Thurman was very influenced by Rufus Jones and by Walt Whitman. Jones was a Quaker mystic, and Howard Thurman was really interested in the God question. And the mystics, whether they be Quaker or whether they be mystics from another tradition, an ancient Christian mystic, a medieval mystic whose roots were in Roman Catholicism, said this about God. He said that when we pray, it would be well to pray like this: O God, beyond the God I name. O God, beyond the God I name. That mystic was Meister Eckhart. And Eckert actually influenced some of the early German pietists and a few of the Anabaptists. The idea is that if God is God, God is beyond our naming of God. But we must name, as Augustine said, so as not to remain silent, but a recognition that the awesome mystery of God is hard to contain in finite human naming. So yeah, and you also mentioned Andy Cordier. I've been very interested in his journey as well. Brethren, political scientist. He and I were born in the same hospital in Stark County, Ohio, and he went on to become many things at the United Nations, and then later an academic and even president at Columbia University. Good response, but I'm going on too long. Some more definitions of what is religion.
So we've got 4 people actually waiting. I'll turn to Terry Lynn first because she couldn't get her mic, and she typed, religion seems to have a connection to institutions, which for many have negative, probably connotations because of the abuses too many have endured.
Good. The institutional link to religion. Most of us on this screen know that link. As I looked at the list of participants, most of you identified yourself with some congregation, with the denomination, and even a district. So that's institution. And when we talk about the purpose of religion and beyond, we might want to ponder how institutions serve the best purposes of religion and how they might hinder the best purposes of religion. Good, Terry Lynn.
And then we'll jump to Eleanor and then to Lowell. Go ahead, Eleanor.
Yep. I think the designation spiritual and religious is helpful in understanding particularly what's going on in our time. But in my opinion, it really is a false dichotomy. I have never seen any new religion, any spiritual group that doesn't start organizing. They almost from the beginning, they try to figure out how to be a group. What are they going to do? What kind of methods are they going to use? And every religion I've ever observed has some ways of trying to seek what they consider to be divine. And so for me, it really is that interplay between what happens for us as individuals, how we understand and want to be a part of something much larger than ourselves, and larger organizations that try to shape that experience. And I do understand that rituals get old and useless. But some of the most fun I've had in my life is trying to create rituals that really speak to the moment.
Yeah, good. Very insightful point that a spiritual experience that one or more might have, especially if we're talking about persons in conversation bound to one another, gives rise to some form of association, some form of organization, some form of institution, and therefore even ritual, if they're low rituals or high rituals.
Over to you, Lowell.
Scott, I want to rewind to the beginning of this conversation and ask you for a clarification. I think the first person to speak was Diane, who cast a definition of religion in terms of humanity's search for God. And I had the sense at the time that you wanted to bracket that concept and set it aside as though we could almost talk about religion without talking about God. Was that your intent? Where were you trying to lead us? What?
Yeah, my intent was to push out the question of what is God into something larger than simply religion is about God. I think that is a given for most religions. Buddhism is considered a religion, but they don't have a conventional concept of God. So my intention wasn't to suggest that religion isn't concerned about God. My only concern was we could say a whole lot about God, and I wanted to say more about God a bit later. And is God always associated with our particular religion, or is our religion a reflection of the divinity, perhaps a partial reflection of divinity? So that's what I was after.
That helps. Thank you. It sounded a little odd, frankly, but I now see where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, I do want us to ponder God before we get away tonight, and how we name God and our naming of God. And a bit later, I want to suggest that in all the great religious traditions, there is an implicit or an explicit understanding that all of our naming of God is symbolic and metaphorical because of what I suggested. In the words of Meister Eckhart, if God is infinite, God must always transcend our finite vocabularies, and therefore we struggle, and sometimes happily so, with mastering the many metaphors for God, and we know there are many. So we'll get to that.
Okay, Ronaldo, back to you, and then we'll see if Marlis wants to contribute or not. Marlis, I saw that you typed in the chat, but I wasn't sure if you were trying to type more. But Ronaldo, first to you.
Thank you. I'm not enough of a scholar to identify the source of where I speak, but in ancient Jewish thought, and I believe many elements of that persist unto this day. The name of God is essentially unpronounceable, which is another way of saying that as soon as you try to name God, you have limited him. And God, the true God, cannot be limited. So in that sense, any name that you give God, whether it's God, Yahweh, Elohim, or whatever that might be, each of these essentially limits who God is, and therefore should not be given great importance. And what is more important is what your experience of that divine reality is, and how that expresses itself in your life. How does your relationship to God, by whatever name you call him or her or it, whatever. I remember being in a session once with a modern mystic, who referred to God as the sacred androgyne. Okay, beyond gender, right? And I think he was saying something very important there. So again, it's how God expresses himself in our lives, particularly when we experience those most significant times of fear or danger or grief or joy, for that matter. That is what really matters. And it is less important what you believe than who you beloved.
Yeah, thanks for that, Rolando. The rabbi Abraham, Joshua, Heschel would echo much of what you have said in his work, insisting that the divine is ineffable. But he would then laugh and say, but we have to somehow F anyway, EFF, because we have to say something about our experience to those we care about. And so we attempt to name what we know is beyond naming, but we name nevertheless. That would be within the realm of a very ancient Hebrew thought as well as mystical thought. Well, how about a few more attempts at what is religion, and then we're going to jump into what is the purpose of religion.
Okay, Scott, we've got two people waiting. Karen, you're first, and then I'll read Terry Lynn's comment.
Okay, now that I've learned how to raise my hand, I don't know if I'll be helpful or just add a wrinkle you don't want, Scott. For me, what gives me fulfillment is the divine God that I always use a capital G on. When I think of culture, I think of a lot of small g gods that become a religion for people. It's unfulfilling and therefore they aren't religious. They'd rather be spiritual because the spirituality is where they're going to find maybe that fulfillment. I think of the God of materialism, buying the latest thing, the God of your favorite sports team or your favorite musician, and that becomes your religion. And when I forget who it was mentioned about the importance of community, so many people find their community in a place other than what I would call a faith-based place. So if I'm thinking about the struggle of church and culture, that's what I think I'm bumping up against, is those small g gods that grab our attention. Don't know if that's where you wanted to go, Scott, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I want to go where you want to go. I want to go where we all want to go in the conversation together, because in a democratic conversation, we hear things that supplement and extend and expand, at times even decenter some of our thinking and invite us to continue thinking even more. So yeah, of course, in ancient Hebrew religion, there was a warning against idolatry and the many idols of a culture, which were certainly not what would be understood as the true and living ground of being, God.
Terry Lynn then writes, there's also many a cultural rather than religious identification like Jewish, Mennonite, Church of the Brethren, Catholic, that speak to practices and traditions rather than faith.
Good. And the dance between culture and church is an interesting conversation. And we could probably pause, and maybe we will, and define what culture is, and whether we could even say anything about faith absent from culture. I get the direction, Terry Lynn, of the comment, but in all humility, I think we all have to confess that in many ways, our images of God are linked to our cultural linguistic contexts. Our friend Matt Gwen used to say that sometimes he wondered if some brethren don't picture God as someone who looks just like good old Uncle Roy Broombaugh in a plaid shirt and a pair of khaki pants. He said that playfully, of course, but often our images of God come to us within a certain cultural linguistic context. And Jesus, of course, would be surprised at some of the images of himself that have appeared in white Christian foyers, the kind of chestnut hair, blue-eyed Jesus as the face of God. Just a quick James Cone joke on that one. James Cone was the father of Black theology. He taught at Union Theological Seminary, has lectured at Bethany. And as he was thinking about the question of how Black is the gospel, and thinking about the Middle Eastern complexion and hair texture of Jesus, he became quite annoyed by the fact that what we call the Solomon Jesus, the artist Solomon, was the artist who portrayed Jesus with long flowing chestnut brown hair and blue eyes and lighter skin. So when James Cone would go to Black churches to preach, and he would see Solomon's Jesus in the foyer or in a Sunday school room, he would say, "Pastor, Pastor, and brother deacons, come, I've got a question. Who's the white guy?" All right, couldn't resist that one.
And we've got one more comment from John.
Oh. We haven't heard anything about tradition. That used to be a wonderful saying, you know, we, instead of denominations, we refer to the different Christian traditions, whether it be Brethren, Mennonite, Lutheran, Episcopal, whatever. And, you know, that has a lot to do with religion and with spirituality as traditions. But all the traditions that I know of, except non-Christian traditions, recognize Jesus as Savior. But there's other traditions out there too. There's like the Sikh that you mentioned. There's the Muslim, Islam. There's Judaism. There's all kinds of various traditions. There's Buddhist traditions. They're wonderful traditions, and they're valuable traditions, and they all seek God. And I'm glad we're moving into that full concept of God and how we relate to God and how God relates to us. That's the most important thing of all. I just finished reading it for the second time, a book that I bought for my daughter about 7 years ago. She's a science teacher, and I wanted her to read it. It's by Francis S. Collins. It's The Language of God. And Francis S. Collins is the head of the National Health Institute today. He's Dr. Fauci's boss. He does a wonderful, wonderful job in explaining his pilgrimage through life from being an atheist to his time today, which he claims to be a Christian. He doesn't say denomination or what, but he does claim to be a Christian. But I also very, very strongly value our brethren beginnings and our brethren beliefs, which we abandoned in the 1800s on universalism. And I see where we could, that is, in my opinion, one of my core beliefs is universalism, and how, you know, we are all saved through Christ, but we're all saved. No matter if we don't know who Christ is, we're saved through Christ, through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross. How God became one of us, the Creator God, the God of all that is beyond creation, who created all things. He became one of us, and whether we believe it or not, I just have a strong feeling that God saves all of us through Christ's sacrifice. But God had to relate to us through Christ to do that. But anyway, that's what I just wanted to bring up. And I wanted to particularly bring up this book, The Language of God. It's a fantastic book. And and it's not that long of a book. And and he talks about the first half of the book, his own pilgrimage, and then the last half of the book, he talks about his relationship to God and how we're all related to God through the various degrees. But anyway, I wanted to bring that up and hope that some of you people can perhaps purchase that book or get it from the library or whatever.
Yeah, thanks, John. I will read that book. It sounds very important. And what you say about tradition, yeah, we have said very little about tradition in a formal way, but certainly religions and spiritualities are carried on via traditions. And there are many traditions, including the Brethren Anabaptist Pietist traditions. And very central to the early Brethren teaching at the beginning was the doctrine, the teaching, the understanding of universal restoration and the idea that God would restore all. A note on that, that teaching was in many ways tabled as being too controversial, so thanks for bringing it up. In October of 2019, I was invited to address the Unitarian Universalist Academic Conference in Baltimore. And when I went, there were a number of professors from Harvard, from Johns Hopkins, from Yale, and they all wanted to talk to me about the Brethren. And you know what they wanted to talk with me about? Brethren's embrace of universal restoration, because they all knew it. And then they taught me something that I didn't know, and that is that a number of their congregations in the South of the United States actually began as Brethren congregations. That in the greater Philly, Ephrata, Lancaster area, Brethren preachers, and they were in the line of Hochman and Mack, were teaching universal restoration, and they moved into the South and they established congregations there. Some of those congregations disappeared, but some of them evolved into Universalist congregations, which then eventually became part of the UU denomination. That was something I didn't know. I, of course, knew all about universal restoration, but I wasn't aware of that history. And so it took a Harvard and a Yale and a Hopkins PhD to remind me of this dimension, this slice of Brethren history. Yeah, that says something about God and our understanding of God. So when we get to God, God is here now. It's not that when we get to him, but when we get to the conversation on God, we'll say more about that. If no one else is really eager to define religion, an overlapping question, and it does overlap, so you might not have as much to say about this question, is what is the purpose of religion? If someone were to ask you quite explicitly, what is the purpose of religion, what would you say? Let me say in the current divisions within the Church of the Brethren, the Mennonite Church, and I'm part of conversations around other church divisions, I find it interesting when I pause and ask the question in the midst of all of these doctrinal and ethical debates about biblical authority or LGBTQ plus inclusion, when I press the question, what is the purpose of religion? People fall silent because it's not something that they are reflecting upon consciously and deliberately. What is the purpose of religion? So I'd like for us to take a bit of time and ponder this question, and I'd like to hear some of your responses. If someone were to ask you, what is the purpose of religion? How would you respond?
Joanna.
I think for me, the purpose of religion is it's a finger that points to this divine mystery, this ineffable God that we cannot name. That's the only purpose it has, is to point us towards that.
Good. Yeah, pointing to the ineffable God, to the holy, to the sacred. Good.
Alice and then Kara.
I think it gives meaning to your life. What is your purpose? How are you to behave in your life, and what are you to do with your life? That answers that question for me.
So religion, we're back to meaning making. Yes, religion provides a sense of meaning, a sense of ordering our lives in a time that can be chaotic without some sense of meaning and order.
I think, I don't know if it's my turn.
Yes,
I'm going to start
please,
talking
go
anyway.
ahead.
For me, I think the purpose of religion is community, and that's what I hope that the goal of religion is. Although I know it isn't everywhere, but I see the goal as being community and supporting each other and supporting a global community and making positive change together.
Good. Religion binds us in a sense of community together.
I feel a lot of times religion for people is a means of being accepted, a means of being comforted, or being, I had a word that I thought of, but I can't think of it right now, but just a sense of purpose, giving people a sense of purpose. When the different religions throughout history were, like idol worship and stuff like that, it was giving people a sense of who they are and what they are and what it means and what's going on. So it's a sense of purpose.
Good. Purpose, meaning.
I think, Scott, there's another thing that I would throw in, and that is religion for me is a means of growth. Growth throughout life, greater and greater involvement with, understanding of, appreciation of, praise for this ineffable spirit we call God.
Yeah, Sonia, this notion of growth and faith, religion, spirituality, I think to many is quite central. Some of you who have connections to Brethren movements, to Bethany, are friends of the Brethren, have heard the name Floyd Malott. Some of you have not. Floyd Sr. was a professor at Bethany who late in life joined the Old Order German Baptist Brethren. His son and grandsons went on to become psychiatrists, and Floyd Jr. was a psychiatrist who thought a lot about the relationship of growth to faith. And he said something about this and about change that I thought was really significant. And I think I can quote him verbatim. He was a member of one of my congregations. In that congregation, I had a number of psychiatrists and psychotherapists. So I had to watch what I said from the pulpit, or I could be really overly analyzed. But Dr. Malott, the psychiatrist, said this with faith in mind: to live is to grow, and to grow is to change. However, if one in one's life of faith cannot understand the difference between that change that occurs as a result of healthy growth and that change that occurs as a result of compromising one's faith, then that individual tends to resist all change. And his or her faith becomes an inhibitor of, rather than a facilitator of, growth. And Dr. Malott really felt that spirituality, religion, the life of faith was linked to human growth. So Sonia, thanks for that comment, because it made me think of my old friend, Dr. Malott. To live is to grow, and to grow is to change. And a healthy faith celebrates the kind of change that leads to human growth and flourishing.
I'm going to turn to John Hoffman. He posted a comment to me that I'll share, but unless, John, are you able to unmute and share it yourself? We'll just wait a minute if you're there. Go ahead.
What I was sharing with Enton was that the purpose of faith is to see how God, the Holy Spirit, and Jesus makes us stronger in love. But the purpose of religion is to corral us into the mode of the same faith. And religion is a lot more restrictive.
Okay, yeah, drawing, I think, an interesting and a helpful distinction between a kind of vibrant and vital faith on the one hand, and various forms of religion that can become kind of reified and ritualized and maybe even controlling on the other hand. Good.
I'm going to jump next to Eleanor, since her phone is running out of power. This may be her only chance to talk.
Yes. I don't disagree with all the very positive things that people have said about the purpose of religion, but just to go back to some of the ways that it can be abusive, it is also can be one of the purposes to be a weapon.
Yeah, and certainly we have seen how religion is weaponized in many traditions. In fact, I was once naive enough to think that at least in Hinduism, because of its polytheism and the belief in many gods, it would be more immune from being weaponized than others. But we know that isn't true, because we have seen some really ugly Hindu violence in the last decade or so against Muslims in India in the name of religion. We've seen this also, those of us who follow the news in Nigeria. We've seen how the peaceful faith of Islam has been weaponized by groups like Boko Haram into a religion of violence. And we've also seen, sadly, in this country, how religion by Christians can be weaponized against others. And I think we're seeing a great deal of that currently with the challenge of democratic institutions and the rise of authoritarian expressions which border fascism, and often there is a religious subtext, and sometimes the primary apologetic is this is the will of God and the way of God. Yeah, so thanks for that. Religion can be a source of terror or transformation. And at Bethany, I teach an entire course on religion as a source of terror and transformation. And we spend the first half of the semester looking at all the ways that religion has terrorized, if not physically through violence, the kind of emotional terrorism that occurs at the hands of religion. And then when everyone is in despair and ready to become card-carrying atheists, Then we move into how religion is also a source of loving and life-giving transformation. And we can all name examples of that as well. So yeah, thanks for that reminder of how tragic it is when religion is weaponized on behalf of other agendas.
And now to Reynaldo, who has been so patient in waiting. It's even gotten dark while you've been waiting. Come ahead, Reynaldo.
Thank you once more. In the Apostle Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his second letter to the Corinthians, chapter 4, we find in verse 7, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellency of the power may be of God and not of us. And I think that whole thing about the vessel metaphor is very important, and that we are the vessels. But a vessel can be cast aside. A vessel can be broken. The vessel can lose its utility. But there's nothing eternal about a vessel. The only thing that's eternal is that which it contains. And that, well, you know, not saying that God can be contained as such, but the whole idea I think that Paul is trying to share here is, let's not confuse the reality with that which contains and tries to express that reality. So yeah, I think that's for me, that is very essential part of the whole Christian idea of what it is to be religious. It's to be a means of caring and of expressing and outpouring as we can, as we may, that which God has filled us with and keeps replenishing.
Yeah, very good. I think this notion of the treasure in an earthen vessel is a wonderful metaphor, one of the many beautiful metaphors for God. The Quaker preacher Elias Hicks was the one who first began to expound on the notion of the inner light, that there is this inner light in all of us. And then, therefore, the notion of all of us, not only within me, but also within my neighbor. And therefore, we seek to honor that light. We seek to honor that treasure in the other. Yeah, very good.
Okay, Monica, and then Eric.
Yeah, thank you. And I'm really glad that Eleanor had a chance to join, because I was going to voice something really similar, that I love these ideals of religion and I think they can all be true. But I really see religion so much as a source of control and of power grabbing, and especially having tried to engage some of this work on racism and anti-racism and white privilege, that the church just has this magnitude of power that has come together over centuries. And there's so much that we just don't even acknowledge. But I've heard the statistic that the church, maybe the Catholic Church, but if you put all churches together, I mean, they're the #1 real estate owner across the world. And the Catholic Church may own more real estate and more prime real estate than any other entity in the world. And there's a reason for that. There's power in that. And there's a collection of wealth and power. And then I'll also just bring up that I recently read, since others are bringing up such good books, a book published by my friend Kyle McCord, who was a Bethany student and did some studying, The Reunion of the Goodweather Suicide Cult. And it explores after a cult has committed suicide together, what happens to the one that is remaining and the psychology of that, the one that didn't die. And so that control and that power, I mean, that's religion as well. And we see that happen, unfortunately, where we follow that power, we follow that because we think that we're following God or looking towards God.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, following Eleanor, Monica, your comments I think are really important because we want to present idealized models of religion, yet we can't forget that many are driven away by the abuses of religion and how it seeks to control, coerce, and in some cases even terrorize. Yeah.
Eric.
I'm listening to Eleanor and Monica, I'm just kind of reminded of my own experiences throughout the church, and just, how I myself just haven't seen the church, or even just religion, I guess in particular, the Christian religion, at its best or most helpful. I've seen it at its most, maybe not its most, but it's more harmful ways of being. And so I guess this is kind of more of an ideal. I think the ideal purpose of religion, at least has throughout my own religious upbringing and journey, has been to answer the questions of why I'm here, and not just why I'm here, but more so, why am I even alive? Why do I exist? Why was I made? Or why was I created? I think so. I think in its most helpful and healthiest forms and expressions, I think the purpose of religion is to answer those questions.
Very good.
And Reynaldo, you have come back.
Oh, I'm beginning to think that maybe I'm saying too much here, because we've had some good contributions from other people as well, certainly. But I want to share two experiences in particular that I've had. They were both encounters. One with a Catholic nun, and another one with a couple of Mormon missionaries. First of all, the Catholic nun. It happens that at this time, I was making my living as a taxi cab driver. So, of course, I picked up all kinds of people, and all kinds of circumstances. And on this particular occasion, there was a charismatic renewal conference going on in town. And this nun was with a group, a couple of other women. And I mentioned that I had previously been connected with the Christian charismatic renewal movement, but no longer was doing so. And without going into whatever else may have occurred in that conversation, the part that I remember is as she gets out of the cab, she says, "I hope you come back to Christ." At which I'm thinking, what? Who said I left? The arrogance to think that I have left Christ because I have left the charismatic Christian renewal movement. Excuse me? So that's one. Okay. And I think we have to be careful not to be like that. I think she set a very bad example. And the experience with the Mormon missionaries. It had been a hot day. I had been working in the community garden. I was on my way back, a distance of something like 4 blocks from the garden back to my house. and I just wanted to get home and get a shower. But here I'm accosted about halfway back by a couple of Mormon missionaries. And I expressed some resistance and said, excuse me, guys, but I've been working hard and I just want to get home and get cleaned up. And one of them says, "What? You're not interested in Jesus Christ today?" To which my response was, "I am interested in Christ today and every day because I know that Christ is interested in me." And I turned on my heel and kept walking.
Well, thanks for sharing those two lived encounters with others around religion, and how I think those narratives help us think about religion and help us define what religion can be. Let's move to a few things about God, and you kind of prompted me here, Rolando, with the example of the nun and of the Mormon. It might surprise some of you, knowing that Bethany Theological Seminary is a seminary affiliated with the Church of the Brethren, that I have in my Theopoetics program. There's a new program we call Theopoetics. I have a Roman Catholic nun as a student, and I have a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints, which is to say, a Mormon in the program. At two partner seminaries in the historic Peace Church tradition, Bethany Church of the Brethren, Earlham School of Religion, Quaker. And some might ask, wow, how did they find their way into Bethany Theological Seminary? And the quick answer is Theopoetics, but the more complicated answer is because we have an expansive understanding of the possibilities of divinity as well as humanity because of God. So I'm going to say a little bit about God and then invite some of you maybe to either join in with your reflections of God and how we name God, or even push back if you feel like perhaps this notion of God is too mystical, too ineffable, too expansive. So in our conversation this evening, I quoted the great medieval mystic Meister Eckhart. This notion that at times when we pray, it could be wise and well to pray, "Oh God, beyond the God I name," as a reminder that the infinite God can never be completely contained in finite human vocabularies. And this is because the great religious traditions of the world and most philosophers of religion would agree that all of our God talk is by nature and necessity metaphorical and symbolic. I would be willing to claim that therefore God is a symbol for God. Now, stay with me on this. Don't worry, I'm not going to launch into a half-hour lecture, but I want you to ponder this question. If God is a symbol for God, what might the implications be for us, for our faith, for our modes of being in the world? Anthropologists remind us that we as humans are symbolic animals. We not only attempt to name divinity symbolically, but we name our world and ourselves in symbolic forms, not only in religion, but in art, in math, and in music. A landscape painting, for example, is a symbolic representation or representation of a particular geography, touched by human imagination. A musical score on the page is notations awaiting acoustic performance. When we teach a young child numbers and how to count, at least when I was in preschool, the preschool teacher put 2 apples here and 2 apples there, and then asked, what is the answer in terms of how many apples we have? And we learned to say 4. At first we said 4 apples, and then we said 4. Another sign and symbol. So we live and we move and we have our being by way of metaphor. So we give the chair an arm. I'm in a chair here, and this is the arm of my chair. We give the table at my right a leg. We fit our shoes with tongues. We give the bottle from which we drink a long, slender neck. The storm gets an eye, and the cave has a mouth. While some of us climb the stairs, when we describe the experience, we often say, I went up a flight of stairs, because there is the metaphor of ascending. So we can ask, is the back of this chair really a back? The metaphor boldly declares it is, but then it whispers, it is not. It is, but it is not. And if we must speak of furniture and our mundane daily furnishings metaphorically, how much more is the rule of metaphor necessary in the naming of the divine? So in Theology 101, we remind our students that God is not merely another being among beings, not even the supreme being, although we sometimes refer to God as the supreme being. God is much greater than that. God is the ground of all being. So if we were fish, God would be the water. If we were birds, God would be the air. So more than just a supreme being, a big being, much bigger than all the little beings, God is the ground of all being. And this too, of course, is a metaphor. I'm not saying that answers all the questions. That too is a metaphor. To turn to an example that many of you might be more familiar with, when we open the blue hymnal, and I'm referring to that hymnal that's used in the Church of the Brethren and in the Mennonite Church USA, although they just recently put out a newer hymnal. It's called the Purple Hymnal. That isn't really what it's called, but it's the Purple Hymnal. We turn to page 77, the hymn, God of Many Names, and we see that God is named as the womb and birth of time, the Rabbi of the poor, the God of Jewish faith, the God of Jesus Christ, the web and womb of love. And this hymn writer, Brian Wren, has another hymn in one of the supplement hymnals called Bring Many Names, Beautiful and Good. And in that hymn, we sing, strong Mother God, warm Father God, old aching God, young growing God, great living God, never fully known, joyful darkness, far beyond our seeing, closer yet than breathing. So, when we finish singing, we don't pause and debate together which metaphor for God is the correct one, which is the right one. Instead, we recognize that all these rich images together, these signs, symbols, metaphors, together express and reveal the awesome mystery of God. And in doing so, we affirm that in our naming of God, our naming is often far more musical than it is flatly metaphysical. It's more poetic than it is propositional. It's more story-shaped than it is statute-driven. And it is always more metaphorical than magical. So when someone asks, wow, how did a Catholic nun and a practicing member of the Church of Jesus Christ of the Latter-day Saints show up in your classroom? This is why, because there is a recognition that no, they're not Quaker, no, they're not Brethren, but they actually are walking a path that is connected to a common divinity and therefore a common humanity. Well, I could say much more about that. So what do you have to say about that? Anything you want to say? Or your definitions of God, the God beyond God, or the God that is near at hand? Anything you want to talk about? Did I spook you with that?
I think of God as the source, capital S.
Yeah, the source of all of our life energy, all of our life. Good. I like that.
For the last decade, I've been working with the elderly, and some of my most difficult but most spiritual conversations that I have been with World War II veterans that could not forgive themselves as 19-year-olds for the people they have killed, or the survivor guilt of 3 and 4 of their best friends that they felt were family die in front of them. The long-term psychological damage that they're taking to the grave with them, that they're finally saying to me, I cannot be loved. I could not give love once I experienced the ravages of war. And I truly feel that because I've broken so many commandments that God can never forgive me. And it's an ongoing conversation of me listening and empathizing, and then telling them that they are beloved, for they were made in the image of God. And it takes weeks. For one gentleman, it took 5 years of me visiting him and saying, you are God's beloved. God adores you. God understands. So this entire conversation keeps bringing back different conversations that I have had of trying to let people know, no matter how broken you are, God's in the midst of those broken clay vessels.
Yeah, thanks, Mary, for that. And in peace studies, we have a description which is psychological as well as spiritual for veterans who experience the kind of guilt and the kind of traumatic memories that you describe. And the name for it is moral injury. And there are persons who are working with this notion of moral injury, those who have encountered this kind of trauma. And there is a component of religion that is really central in the New Testament, and sometimes those of us in the historic peace churches, because we really want to be prophetic on behalf of social justice, sometimes we ignore it, and that is the notion of grace, and that grace is central to a spiritual and a religious sensibility. And in fact, in that classic passage on how we are in fact saved by grace in the book of Ephesians, in that very passage, the text also says, "For you are God's," the King James says, "God's workmanship." A literal translation is, "You are God's poetry, you are God's poem, and you are saved by a gracious God." I think it's really important for us to remind ourselves of this message of grace. And at the origins of the Brethren movement, and I'm talking about at the very beginning, there were two leaders. One was Alexander Mack, who became the dominant leader, and his mentor. His mentor was Ernst Christoph Hochmann von Hochenau, and he preached a very strong message of grace and universal restoration. And in fact, he made the claim that many of the beliefs and behaviors that are part of religious rituals and doctrines are overshadowed by grace. And they had a break. And Holkman was exiled from that early circle of what we would call now the Brethren. And Mack developed a much more rigorous theology of obedience to God and obedience to the church. And look out, if you aren't obedient, you're going to get corrected. And there was something called the ban. And you wonder where Alexander Mack got that idea. He got it from a man he admired by the name of Jacob Amen, the leader of the Amish, who broke away from the Mennonites. Maybe that's more Brethren history and church history than you want, but I do think the recovery of grace is important because for some, we're justified by belief. And I would say those are the persons who are concerned about correct doctrine. And you know many of them, I don't have to name them, or even their groups. They're justified by correct belief. On the other hand, there are those who feel we are justified by right behavior in all occasions. And now we're friendlier to those, I think, most of us on this screen. We like right behavior, as well we should, but I think it's important to remember. I could take you down through Romans or Ephesians or Galatians, and we could go back to the gospel, that it really is grace, and it's grace that gives rise then to our beliefs, our behaviors. It's belonging to God and belonging to one another. And what comes later, I think, are more dialogues and more debates around interesting turns in belief and behavior. You know, many churches, including churches in our own orbit, teach seekers, searchers, persons who come looking that, well, first you got to believe A, B, and C, and then you got to behave like X, Y, and Z, and then you belong. I think a message of grace would say, if you're seeking God and you're seeking the good company of this community, you belong. And belief and behavior are something that can evolve. And that's not a kind of shallow humanism that is a deep and rich theology of grace, I would argue. Well, now I'm preaching. Sorry about that. I just couldn't help myself. What else would you like to say about any of this or God?
We've got about 10 minutes left. And Kara, I saw you had your hand up. Did you want to jump in?
Sure. Where am I? There I am. I was just going to share this conversation about defining God brought up a memory for me of a conversation I had with a friend, and I don't remember who it was. It may have been somebody here, but this friend had offered a practice for dealing with doubt, especially doubt after loss and dealing with anger towards God. And the practice was just to substitute in any conversation that you have with God, whether it be through music or, you know, hymns or prayer or anything like that, to just substitute the word God with love or with peace, and to pray to a grander love or a grander divine peace, and to do that until putting God back in those contexts felt right. And I have used that before, and I've found that really helpful. And also that has changed kind of my idea and my definition of God.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And actually in a congregation that I pastored, a wise person in the church suggested that very method to persons who were struggling with concepts of God, that if God is love, when you see the name God in a hymnal, sing love instead. If God is peace, sing peace and instead. And interestingly enough, some sang their way into naming God, but it was naming God differently and otherwise than they had named God before. Thanks for sharing that. I think that can be really a useful and beautiful pastoral approach to persons who have been wounded and terrorized by certain images and metaphors of God.
Coming now to Kentucky, Steve.
First, let me say hi to all my friends. I see a whole lot of people that I know out there. We've talked a lot tonight about how God is a greater than any name. You can't put God in a box, or God is too small. But it seems to me, historically, we had the exact reverse problem, that God was so aloof, God was so remote, God was so distant that people didn't understand much about him. And that's why I understand that he sent Jesus to earth, was so that we could learn more about him. We could learn through the teachings, the preachings, the healings of Christ, learn much more about earth. So I think there's kind of a flip side to that God can be so remote that we need a way to get a more detailed understanding of who God is.
Yeah, great addition to the conversation, because very true. God can seem so remote and so distant that we need the image of the incarnation. And therefore, Jesus becomes the human face of God. So that becomes an important, I think, piece of the conversation. If you look at me flipping through something, I was looking for a poem that addresses that, but usually I have every poem I need at my fingertips, but I found it. There it is. Let me read this poem. It's by Naomi Shihab Nye, and she was mentored by William Stafford. William Stafford, one of the great Brethren poets. And He actually did receive a brethren baptism that was once disputed, but we know that he did join the church. Was sometimes careless about church attendance, but aren't we all now and then and from time to time? He mentored Naomi Shihab Nye. Naomi has Palestinian American roots. She is a Palestinian Christian. And she read this poem for the first time just down the street from where I am at this very moment in Yellow Springs, Ohio at Antioch College. And it's entitled, I Feel Sorry for Jesus. And yeah, conversations like this are really important because Jesus becomes a really important corrective for us for the remoteness of God. But then sometimes we can feel that we know Jesus too well, that we've got it all figured out, right? So this is Naomi Shihab Nye, I Feel Sorry for Jesus. People won't leave him alone. I know he said, wherever two or more are gathered in my name, but I'll bet some days he regrets it. Cozily, they tell you what he wants and doesn't want as if they just got an email. Remember a telephone that pass it on, where the message changed dramatically by the time it rounded the circle? Well, people blame terrible pieties on Jesus. They try to feel like his special pet. Jesus deserves better. I think he's been exhausted for a very long time. He went into the desert, friends. He didn't go to the pomp. He didn't go to the golden chandeliers and say, the truth tastes better here. See, I'm talking like I know. It's dangerous talking for Jesus. You get carried away almost immediately. I stood in the spot where he was born. I closed my eyes where he died and didn't die. Every twist of the Via Dolorosa was written on my skin. And that makes me feel like being silent, you know, a secret pouch of listening. You won't hear me talk like this again. Naomi Shihab Nye.
Scott, I
Well, it
think we
looks
had
like we're
one.
out of time.
We did. Eleanor had perhaps one more comment. Eleanor, if you make it quick, you can have our last comment before Scott has the last word.
Very quick, lovely presentation on metaphor, Scott. Thank you so much. And two songs came into my head, Amazing Grace and, well, no, I've forgotten the other one. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow.
Yeah, those I think are really great songs and great hymns. And in theopoetics, we would say that they are also great poems. I'm going to leave you with two very short poems that we also like in our theopoetics program. The one very short poem is by Rumi. And Rumi was a very spiritual person, a person of peace, a Sufi within Islam. It's called Out Beyond Ideas. And we have shared so many great ideas here tonight. I loved every one of them. Out beyond ideas. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there. When the soul lies down in that grass, the world is too full to talk about. Ideas, language, even the phrase each other doesn't make any sense. And the second poem is by a Jewish poet who worked in the Jewish peace movement, Yehuda Amichai, and it's called The Place Where We Are Right. From the place where we are right, flowers will never grow in the spring. The place where we are right is hard and trampled like a yard. But doubts and loves dig up the world like a mole, a plow, and a whisper will be heard in the place where the ruined house once stood. Yehuda Hamakai. Well, it's been great being with you. This was really enjoyable for me. I'm on sabbatical, and when Monica said she wanted this to be conversational, I was really happy because I enjoy occasions where I can listen and learn as well as contribute to the conversation, because the best theology is democratic. We must democratize not only our conversations, but I'll leave you with this: we must also democratize the notion of God. So thanks for this. It's been great.
Thank you, Scott. And there's been a lot of expressions of appreciation in the chat as well. So
good.
And friends, that concludes our course for the evening. We want to remind you that we have 2 other courses coming up shortly. And it's a part 1 and part 2 that Eleanor will be leading us on. The first is October 16th and then November 13th. And so you may want to be tuned in for everything you wanted to know about race, but were afraid to ask, part 1 and part 2. But for now, Scott, so glad that you were on sabbatical and had the time to join us. Appreciate so much. Scott, do you have time to hang around for another 5 minutes or so if people wanted to just chat with you?
Yeah, I do. Sure.
Okay.
Sure.
So if you need to go, you can go. But if you want to stay and chat a little, feel free. Thanks so much.